Hazel Vance clutched her ragged valise as the stagecoach rumbled to a halt, sending a cloud of dust into the hot Wyoming air. Through the window, she caught her first glimpse of Jamestown, not much more than a dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, a far cry from the bustling streets of Boston she'd left behind. The year was 1875, and at 24 years old, she was beginning a journey she never imagined taking, meeting a husband she had never seen. Her gloved hand trembled as she adjusted the pin holding her dark chestnut hair in its modest updo. The jagged scar that ran from her right temple down to her jaw felt particularly conspicuous today. She'd worn her best bonnet, angled carefully to cast a shadow over the damaged side of her face, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. It never was. "Miss, we've arrived," the driver called, opening the door and extending his weathered hand. Hazel stepped down, her boots meeting Wyoming soil for the first time. Main Street stretched before her, a handful of townsfolk going about their business. Somewhere in this remote outpost was the man who had responded to her advertisement, a cattle rancher named Bryce Foster who sought a wife to share his life. "You'll be wanting Hennessy's Hotel," the driver said, pointing to a two-story building with a wide porch. "The rancher usually comes to town on Thursdays for supplies. That's tomorrow." "Thank you," Hazel murmured, gathering her courage along with her bags. As she walked toward the hotel, she felt eyes following her. She kept her head slightly turned, the scarred side away from curious onlookers. 7 years had passed since the fire that took her parents and left her marked, but the weight of strangers' stares never lightened. The hotel lobby was simple but clean, with a polished wooden counter and a stern-faced woman behind it. "I'm Hazel Vance," she said, setting down her valise. "I believe there may be a room reserved for me. I'm here to meet Mr. Foster." The woman's eyes widened slightly as they flickered to the visible edge of Hazel's scar. "Another mail-order bride, third one this year for poor Mr. Foster." She shook her head. "I'm Margaret Hennessy. My husband and I own this establishment." "Third." Hazel's stomach tightened. "The other two took one look at that ranch and hightailed it back east on the next stage," Mrs. Hennessy said, handing over a key. "Room 4, upstairs on the right, washrooms at the end of the hall." Hazel thanked her and climbed the narrow staircase. The room was sparse but tidy, a single bed with a quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a small window overlooking the dusty street below. She set down her belongings and sank onto the edge of the bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back. What had she done? Traveling across the country to marry a stranger was madness. But what choice did she have? After her parents' death, she'd been taken in by her mother's cousin, who had made it increasingly clear that Hazel was a burden, especially once her daughters had begun courting. No respectable man in Boston would consider a scarred spinster with no fortune. When she'd seen the advertisement for wives willing to travel west, it had seemed like Providence. Hazel splashed cool water on her face, careful around the tight, shiny skin of her scar. She would rest tonight, and tomorrow she would meet the man who might become her husband if he could bear to look at her. Morning came too quickly. Hazel dressed in her second-best dress, a modest blue cotton with a high collar. She arranged her hair to partially cover the right side of her face and secured her bonnet. In the small mirror above the washstand, she practiced a smile that didn't pull awkwardly at her scarred cheek. After a simple breakfast in the hotel dining room, she took a seat in the small lobby, her hands folded in her lap, a book open but unread. The minutes crawled by like hours. At precisely 10 o'clock, the hotel door swung open and a tall figure blocked the sunlight. Hazel's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked up. Bryce Foster was nothing like she had imagined. He was tall and broad-shouldered, as expected of a rancher, but there was a gentleness in his bearing that surprised her. His face was tanned from the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often. Dark blonde hair fell across his forehead, and a neatly trimmed beard covered his strong jaw. He wore simple clothes, a checked shirt, worn denim pants, and a dusty hat, which he promptly removed upon entering. Their eyes met across the room, and Hazel instinctively turned her head, presenting her unblemished profile. "Miss Vance." His voice was deep and steady, with a slight drawl. Hazel rose, her book forgotten. "Mr. Foster, it's a pleasure to finally meet you." He crossed the room in a few long strides, extending his hand. "The pleasure is mine, madam. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." "It was." "Educational," she replied, placing her gloved hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle. Bryce Foster was 32, and up close, Hazel could see the tiny crow's feet around his blue eyes and the streaks of lighter blonde in his beard where the sun had bleached it. He was handsome in a rugged way that spoke of hard work and honest living. "I thought perhaps we might take lunch at the cafe across the street," he suggested. "Get acquainted before I show you the ranch." "That would be lovely," she answered, gathering her shawl. As they crossed the street, Hazel was acutely aware of the townspeople watching. She heard whispers, "Foster's new bride," and "Wonder if this one will stay," and kept her eyes fixed firmly ahead. The cafe was small and homey, with checkered tablecloths and the aroma of fresh bread. They sat at a corner table, and a plump waitress bustled over with coffee. "So, Mr. Foster," Hazel began. "Bryce, please," he interrupted with a smile. "Bryce," she corrected. "Your letters mentioned cattle ranching. I admit I know very little about it." "It's hard work but rewarding," he said, his face lighting up. "My father started with just 20 head after the war. Now we run close to 300 on 500 acres. It's beautiful country, rolling hills, good water from Elk Creek. The house isn't fancy, but it's solid. 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen." As he spoke about the ranch, Hazel studied him carefully. There was pride in his voice, but also something else, a loneliness, perhaps. She wondered about the other brides who had come and gone. "I should be honest with you," she said finally, during a lull in the conversation. She took a deep breath and slowly turned her face fully toward him for the first time. "This is why I came west. In Boston, this makes a woman unmarriageable." Bryce's eyes widened slightly as he took in the full extent of her scarring, the way it pulled at the corner of her eye and mouth, the shiny, rippled skin that extended down her neck and disappeared beneath her high collar. But to his credit, his expression didn't change to disgust or pity. "A fire?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "7 years ago, my parents didn't survive." He was silent for a moment, then said, "My mother had a saying, scars are just proof you were stronger than whatever tried to hurt you." The simple statement, delivered without sentiment or condescension, brought unexpected tears to Hazel's eyes. She blinked them back quickly. "The lady at the hotel mentioned there were others before me," she said, changing the subject. Bryce sighed, running a hand through his hair. "2. The first was a banker's daughter from Philadelphia who took one look at the isolation and decided frontier life wasn't for her. The second—" he paused. "Well, she left a note saying she'd met someone in town she preferred." "I'm sorry," Hazel said sincerely. He shrugged. "It's not an easy life." "I wanted to be honest about that in my letters." "You were," she assured him. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Foster Bryce, and I've had my fill of city living." After lunch, Bryce helped her into his wagon for the journey to the ranch. The wooden seat was hard, and the road was little more than a rutted trail, but Hazel found herself enjoying the vastness of the landscape. Miles of waving grass stretched to the horizon, punctuated by rocky outcroppings and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees. "It's beautiful," she breathed, taking in the wild emptiness of it all. "It can be harsh in winter," Bryce warned, "and the summers get hot enough to fry an egg on a rock. But yes, it's beautiful." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the steady clip-clop of the horses and the creak of wagon wheels the only sounds. Hazel found herself stealing glances at Bryce's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the sun caught in his beard. "What made you decide to advertise for a wife?" she asked finally. He kept his eyes on the road. "Ranching is lonely work. I have a foreman, Ellie, and a couple of hands during calving season, but most days it's just me and the cattle. My father passed 3 years back, and the house has been too quiet since." He glanced at her. "What made you answer such an advertisement?" Hazel looked down at her gloved hands. "After my parents died, I lived with relatives who made it clear I was unwelcome. I worked as a seamstress, but—" she gestured vaguely toward her face. "Customers were uncomfortable. Your advertisement seemed like a chance at a new beginning." "That's all any of us want out here," Bryce said softly. As they crested a hill, the Foster ranch came into view. A modest 2-story house stood in a small valley, with a barn and several outbuildings nearby. A creek wound through the property, bordered by cottonwoods. In the distance, cattle grazed on the rolling hills. "It's not much," Bryce said apologetically, "but it's home." To Hazel, who had spent the last 7 years in a cramped back room in her cousin's house, it looked like paradise. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, and Bryce jumped down, coming around to help her. His hands were warm and strong at her waist as he lifted her down. "Would you like to see inside?" he asked, suddenly looking nervous. The house was simple but well built, with a spacious kitchen and comfortable sitting room downstairs. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and windows let in plenty of light. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, one clearly Bryce's, with a large bed and sparse furnishings, and another smaller room that he explained had been his parents'. "I thought, if you decided to stay, this could be yours, until—" he trailed off, a flush creeping up his neck. "Until we decide if we suit," Hazel finished for him, appreciating his delicacy. "Yes, madam," he said, visibly relieved. That night, after a simple supper that Bryce prepared, "I'm no cook, but I can manage beans and bacon," they sat on the porch watching the sun set. The sky blazed orange and pink, casting long shadows across the land. "It's so quiet," Hazel remarked. After the constant noise of Boston, the silence was almost unnerving. "Too quiet for you?" Bryce asked, a note of worry in his voice. She considered this. "No, I think I could grow to love it." The following days fell into a pattern. Bryce would rise before dawn for his chores, and Hazel would prepare breakfast. She took over the cooking, grateful to discover the pantry was well stocked with basics. During the days, she explored the house, making mental notes of improvements she could make if she stayed. On the 3rd day, Bryce returned from checking the herd to find her in the vegetable garden behind the house, which had clearly been neglected. "My mother used to grow tomatoes and beans here," he said, watching as Hazel pulled weeds from the overgrown plot. "Nothing fancy, but it helped through the winter." "I could replant it," she offered. "I'm not much of a gardener, but I can learn." He smiled, that warm, genuine smile that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "I'd like that." As the days passed, Hazel found herself relaxing in Bryce's company. He never stared at her scar or seemed uncomfortable when she forgot to keep her damaged side turned away. He treated her with a respectful consideration that was entirely new to her experience. One evening, as they sat on the porch after supper, Bryce asked, "How are you finding Jamestown, Miss Vance?" "Hazel, please," she reminded him. "And I think I could be happy here." It was the most honest thing she'd said in years. The following Sunday, they attended church in town together. Hazel was acutely aware of the curious stares as they entered the small white building. Whispers followed them down the aisle. "That's her Foster's new mail-order bride. Lord, look at her face. Wonder how long this one will stay." Bryce must have heard too, for his jaw tightened, but he said nothing, simply placing a protective hand at the small of her back as he guided her to a pew. After the service, several women approached, their curiosity barely disguised as welcome. "Mrs. Foster, we're so pleased to meet you," said an elegantly dressed woman in her 50s. "I'm Judith Thornton, the mayor's wife." "It's still Miss Vance, actually," Hazel corrected gently. "Mr. Foster and I are becoming acquainted." A younger woman with shrewd eyes and a fashionable hat smirked. "Of course, just like the last two." "Sarah," Mrs. Thornton chided, but the damage was done. "If you'll excuse us," Bryce said firmly, taking Hazel's elbow. "We have a long ride back to the ranch." The wagon ride home was silent, a tension between them that hadn't existed before. Finally, Hazel said, "I'm sorry about the gossip." Bryce's hands tightened on the reins. "It's not your concern. Small towns have long memories and loose tongues." "Do they bother you?" "The stares, the whispers," he glanced at her, understanding in his eyes. "Not for the reasons you might think. I'm only bothered that they might hurt you." The simple statement warmed something in Hazel's chest. That night, unable to sleep, Hazel slipped downstairs for a glass of water. She found Bryce still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a ledger open before him. "Ranching troubles?" she asked, filling a glass from the pump. He looked up, seeming grateful for the interruption. "Cattle prices are down this year, nothing we haven't weathered before, but—" He sighed, rubbing his forehead. Hazel hesitated, then sat across from him. "May I?" She gestured toward the ledger. Bryce pushed it toward her, looking surprised. "You understand ranch accounts?" "My father was an accountant," she explained, scanning the neat columns of figures. "I helped in his office before." She touched her scar unconsciously. For the next hour they bent over the accounts together, Hazel making suggestions for economies that might help stretch their resources. It was well past midnight when they finished, both yawning but satisfied with the improved financial outlook. "You're remarkable," Bryce said as they climbed the stairs to their separate bedrooms. "I haven't met many women who could make sense of those numbers." "There's a lot you don't know about me," Hazel replied with a small smile. "I'm looking forward to learning," he said, his voice soft in the darkness of the hallway. 2 weeks into her stay, Hazel rode with Bryce to check the far pasture. She'd never been on a horse before coming west, but she was a quick learner, and Bryce was a patient teacher. The gentle mare he'd selected for her plodded along beside his more spirited gelding. "You're a natural," he called as they crested a hill. "Most city folks take months to get comfortable in the saddle." Hazel laughed, the sound surprising her. When had she last truly laughed? "I think Daisy here is just exceptionally well behaved." They stopped to rest by a clear stream, letting the horses drink while they shared a simple lunch of bread and cheese. The sun was warm on their backs, and a gentle breeze stirred the tall grass. "I've been thinking," Bryce said, breaking a comfortable silence. "The fall cattle drive to Cheyenne is coming up next month. I'll be gone about 2 weeks." He looked at her hesitantly. "Will you be all right at the ranch alone? Illy will check in on you, but—" "I'll manage," Hazel assured him, touched by his concern. "Though I may burn the biscuits beyond recognition without you to rescue them." He grinned at the reference to her first cooking disaster. "You've improved considerably. I haven't found a single eggshell in my scrambled eggs for at least 3 days." "High praise indeed, Mr. Foster," she teased. As they gathered their things to continue the ride, Bryce suddenly stilled, his hand going to her arm. "Don't move," he whispered. Hazel froze, her heart pounding. Following Bryce's gaze, she saw what had alarmed him, a large mountain lion crouched in the rocks above the stream, regarding them with unblinking yellow eyes. "Back away slowly," Bryce murmured, easing his rifle from its scabbard. "Get to your horse, but no sudden movements." Hazel did as instructed, her legs trembling. The mare sensed her fear and shifted nervously. The mountain lion's tail twitched, its muscles bunching. "Easy now," Bryce soothed, keeping himself between Hazel and the predator. The cat's ears flattened, and with a snarl it launched itself toward them. Bryce fired, the shot echoing across the hills. The lion stumbled but kept coming. He fired again, and this time the animal collapsed, mere feet from where they stood. Hazel realized she was shaking uncontrollably. Without a word, Bryce gathered her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair. "I've got you." She could feel his heart hammering as rapidly as her own. For long moments they stood like that, his strong arms around her, her face pressed against his shirt. When she finally pulled back to look up at him, something had changed in his eyes. "I wouldn't have let anything happen to you," he said softly. "I know," she whispered. That evening, after they'd returned to the ranch, Bryce built a fire despite the mild weather. They sat close together on the small sofa, the day's events having erased some invisible barrier between them. "I've never been that frightened," Hazel admitted, staring into the flames. "It was your first mountain lion," Bryce said, attempting lightness. "They tend to have that effect." She turned to look at him, studying the strong lines of his profile. "No, I meant, I've never been that frightened of losing something I've only just found." Bryce's breath caught. Slowly he reached out and took her hand in his. "Hazel," he said, her name a question in his mouth. "I know it's only been a few weeks," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "and we hardly know each other. But I feel it too," he interrupted, his blue eyes intense in the firelight. "From the moment you turned and showed me your scar, unashamed and honest, I knew you were different." "My scar doesn't repulse you?" she asked, the question that had lingered unspoken between them. "Repulse me?" He looked genuinely confused. "Hazel, nothing about you could repulse me." His hand came up to gently touch her cheek, fingers tracing the ridged skin with a tenderness that made her eyes fill with tears. "This is part of you, part of your strength. How could I not admire it?" Hazel couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. For 7 years, she had been defined by her disfigurement, reduced to an object of pity or revulsion. And here was this man, this good, honest man, looking at her as though she were whole and beautiful. "Bryce," she managed finally, "I think I could love you very easily." His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I think I'm already halfway there myself." He leaned forward, hesitating just a breath away from her lips, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Hazel closed the distance between them. The kiss was gentle at first, a question asked and answered. Then, as Bryce's arms came around her, it deepened into something more urgent, years of loneliness melting away in the warmth between them. When they finally parted, both breathless, Bryce pressed his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Not just as my housekeeper or accountant, stay as my wife." "Are you certain?" Hazel asked, needing to be sure. "This is no small decision." "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he declared, his voice firm. "Marry me, Hazel Vance. Make this house a home again." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Bryce Foster." They were married 2 days later in the Jamestown church, with only the preacher, Eli the foreman, and a handful of townsfolk as witnesses. Hazel wore her best dress, a dove gray silk that she'd carefully altered to fit her slender frame. Bryce wore a clean shirt and his least worn pants, his hair still damp from washing. As they exchanged vows, Hazel was aware of the whispers settling for damaged goods and won't last the winter, but they seemed distant and unimportant. What mattered was Bryce's steady gaze, his warm hands holding hers and the future stretching before them. The first month of marriage was a gentle dance of discovery. They moved Hazel's belongings into the master bedroom, and Bryce proved to be a considerate and tender husband. Their days followed the rhythm of the ranch: early mornings, hard work, and evenings spent planning for the future. Hazel planted her garden, coaxing tomatoes and beans from the Wyoming soil. She made curtains for the bare windows from fabric purchased in town, and slowly, the house began to feel like the home she'd described to Bryce that first night. The fall cattle drive loomed, a necessary but unwelcome separation. The night before Bryce was to leave, they lay awake in their bed, Hazel's head on his chest, his fingers combing through her unbound hair. 2 weeks will pass quickly, he assured her. And when I return, we'll have enough money to see us through the winter comfortably. I know, Hazel said, tracing patterns on his skin. I'll be fine. I've become quite the frontierswoman, you know, he chuckled, the sound rumbling under her ear. That you have. Still, I'll worry. Then hurry back to me, she said, tilting her face up for his kiss. The morning of his departure arrived too soon. Hazel rose before dawn to prepare a hearty breakfast, fighting back tears as she packed provisions for his journey. Bryce and Ali would drive 60 head of cattle to Cheyenne, along with 2 young ranch hands, Tom and Seth. As the men prepared to leave, Bryce pulled Hazel aside, pressing something into her hand. It was a small Derringer pistol. "Keep this with you," he said seriously. "I pray you'll never need it, but I'd rest easier knowing you have it." Hazel nodded, slipping the weapon into her pocket. "I'll be waiting right here when you return," she promised. His kiss was lingering, a promise of his own. Then he was gone, riding off with the men and cattle, leaving Hazel alone on the porch, her hand raised in farewell until the dust cloud disappeared over the horizon. The first few days of Bryce's absence passed uneventfully. Hazel kept busy with household tasks, tending her growing garden and continuing the improvements to the house. She discovered a talent for baking and was experimenting with different types of bread. On the 4th day, she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Thinking it might be Ali checking on her as promised, she shaded her eyes against the midday sun. 3 riders were approaching strangers, not the familiar figure of the foreman. Unease prickled along Hazel's spine. She remembered Bryce's warning to be cautious of travelers, especially with him away. Her hand slipped into her pocket, feeling the reassuring weight of the Derringer. As the men drew closer, Hazel stepped onto the porch, keeping her hand in her pocket. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she called, proud of how steady her voice sounded. The men reined in their horses. The leader, a lean man with a pockmarked face and cold eyes, smiled unpleasantly. "Well now, what have we here? You must be Foster's new bride." Heard he'd finally found someone desperate enough to take him. Hazel stiffened. "My husband isn't home, I'll tell him you called." The second man, heavy-set with a bushy beard, laughed. "We know he ain't home, madam, that's why we came callin'. What do you want?" Hazel demanded, her heart racing. "Just being neighborly," the third man said, younger than the others with a cruel twist to his mouth. "Foster's got bad blood with my brother. Thought we'd pay a friendly visit while he's away." Hazel realized with growing alarm that these men meant her harm. She edged backward toward the door. "I think you should leave. Now." The leader dismounted, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the dirt. Now, don't be unfriendly. We just want to see what kind of woman would marry a man like Foster." His eyes raked over her, lingering on her scarred cheek. "Though I guess beggars can't be choosers, huh, boys?" The other men laughed, also dismounting. They spread out, clearly intending to surround the porch. Hazel's mind raced. The nearest neighbor was miles away. She was entirely alone with only a two-shot Derringer against 3 armed men. She needed to get inside where she could barricade the door. She turned and bolted for the entrance, but the youngest man was quicker, leaping onto the porch and grabbing her arm. "Not so fast, pretty lady," he sneered, yanking her back. Without thinking, Hazel pulled the Derringer from her pocket and fired. The shot went wide, but the man released her with a startled curse. She stumbled back, raising the gun again. "The next one won't miss," she warned, her voice shaking but determined. The leader held up his hands in a placating gesture, but his eyes were calculating. "Now, there's no need for that. We were just funning." "Get off my property," Hazel said firmly, the gun steady in her hand. The standoff might have ended there, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the tense moment. All heads turned to see a lone rider galloping toward the house, rifle in hand. It wasn't Bryce. This man was older, with silver hair and a weathered face. He reined in his horse sharply, the rifle aimed squarely at the pockmarked leader. "Dawson, you sorry excuse for a man," the newcomer called. "Threatening a woman alone, even for you, that's low." The man called Dawson's face twisted with anger. "This ain't your business, Jenkins." "I'm making it my business," Jenkins replied calmly. "Now, you and your boys are going to mount up and ride out, or I'm going to put a hole in you that the doctor in Jamestown can't fix." There was a moment of tense silence, then Dawson spat on the ground. "Come on, boys." "This ain't worth the trouble." He glared at Hazel. "Tell your husband we'll settle up proper when he's back." The 3 men mounted and rode away, casting dark looks over their shoulders. Hazel's legs suddenly felt like water and she sank down onto the porch steps, the Derringer still clutched in her trembling hand. The older man dismounted and approached cautiously. "Mrs. Foster, are you hurt?" Hazel shook her head, trying to compose herself. "No, thanks to you." "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Jenkins." "Harold Jenkins," he introduced himself, touching the brim of his hat. "I ranch the next property over. Bryce and I go back a ways." "Please come inside," Hazel offered, rising on unsteady legs. "The least I can do is offer you some coffee." Over coffee and fresh baked bread, Harold explained that he'd been riding his fence line when he heard the gunshot. "Those are the Dawson brothers," he told her grimly. "Bad lot. The youngest, Jamie, got in a fight with Bryce last year over some strayed cattle. Bryce broke his jaw." "I see," Hazel said, her hand still trembling slightly around her coffee cup. "They're cowards at heart," Harold assured her. "But I don't like the idea of you out here alone with them nursing a grudge. Why don't you come stay at my place until Bryce gets back?" "My wife Martha would be glad for the company." Hazel considered the offer. It was tempting, but this was her home now. Running away at the first sign of trouble wasn't the kind of wife she wanted to be. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, but I'll stay," she said firmly. "This is my home and I won't be driven from it." Harold studied her for a long moment, then nodded with approval. "You're a good match for Bryce, Mrs. Foster. He needs someone with backbone." He rose from the table. "I'll stop by daily until he returns. And I'll send word to Sheriff Miller about the Dawsons." After Harold left, Hazel double-checked all the doors and windows, the Derringer close at hand. That night, she slept fitfully, startling at every creak and rustle of the wind. True to his word, Harold rode over each morning for the next week. Sometimes he brought his wife Martha, a cheerful woman who immediately took a liking to Hazel. They shared recipes and gardening tips, and Martha taught Hazel how to properly can vegetables for the winter. "You're going to do just fine out here," Martha assured her over jars of pickled beans. Most city women would have been on the first stage back east after those Dawson boys showed up. I have more to lose by leaving than by staying, Hazel replied simply. The day Bryce was due to return, Hazel was nearly sick with anticipation. She baked his favorite biscuits and stewed a rabbit that Harold had brought by. She swept the house from top to bottom and put fresh wildflowers on the table. When she finally heard hoofbeats approaching, she rushed outside, her heart in her throat. Bryce was riding ahead of the other men, his face breaking into a wide smile when he spotted her on the porch. He practically leapt from his horse, sweeping her into a fierce embrace that lifted her feet from the ground. "I missed you something terrible," he murmured against her hair. "And I you," she replied, holding him tight, breathing in the scent of dust and horses and the man she had come to love. Later, after the men had been fed and had departed for their own homes, Bryce and Hazel sat before the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting in the familiar hollow of his chest. "Harold told me about the Dawsons," Bryce said, his voice tight with anger. "I should never have left you alone. You couldn't have known," Hazel soothed, "and I wasn't harmed. But you could have been," he insisted, his arm tightening around her, "if Harold hadn't come when he did." "But he did," she reminded him, "and I had your Derringer." "I wasn't entirely helpless." Bryce lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You are the bravest woman I've ever known, Hazel Foster. Do you know that?" The use of his surname with her still sent a thrill through her. "I'm not brave," she demurred. "I was terrified." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," he said softly. "It's facing that fear head on." His fingers traced the outline of her scar, "like you've been doing all your life." Hazel leaned into his touch, no longer self-conscious about the damaged skin. "I never thought I would find someone who could look at me and see past this," she confessed. "In Boston, men would cross the street to avoid walking near me." "Then they were fools," Bryce declared, "because all I see when I look at you is the most beautiful woman in Wyoming territory." As winter descended on the ranch, Bryce and Hazel fell into a comfortable routine. The cattle drive had been successful, providing them with enough money to make it through the lean months comfortably. They added a room to the house, a small study where Hazel could manage the ranch accounts, which she had taken over completely. The Dawson brothers had been arrested by Sheriff Miller for causing trouble in town and were serving 6 months in the Cheyenne jail. The threat they had posed seemed distant now, though Bryce remained vigilant. Christmas approached, bringing with it a blanket of snow that transformed the ranch into a wonderland of white. Hazel decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, determined to make their first Christmas together special. On Christmas Eve, they exchanged simple gifts by the fire: a new hat for Bryce, hand-knitted by Hazel over many secret evenings, and for Hazel, a beautiful silver locket containing a tiny photograph of the two of them, taken in Jamestown by a traveling photographer. "It's perfect," she whispered, tears in her eyes as Bryce fastened it around her neck. "I have one more thing for you," he said, suddenly looking nervous. "It's not wrapped." From his pocket he withdrew a small wooden cradle, exquisitely carved with delicate leaves and flowers. "Bryce," Hazel breathed, taking the tiny cradle in her hands. "I know it's early yet," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and maybe presumptuous, but I hoped, someday." Hazel set the cradle carefully on the table and took her husband's hands in hers. "It's not presumptuous," she said softly. "In fact, it's rather timely." His eyes widened. "Are you saying?" She nodded, her face radiant. "Dr. Lewis confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. We're going to have a baby, Bryce, in June." With a whoop of joy, Bryce lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her down gently, suddenly concerned. "Should I be doing that? Is it safe?" Hazel laughed, the sound like music in the cozy room. "I'm not made of glass, my love. The baby and I are both hardy stock." Bryce knelt before her, placing his hand reverently on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said in wonder. "Our baby." As spring arrived, bringing new calves to the ranch and color to the landscape, Hazel's body changed with the season. Her dresses needed letting out, and she moved more carefully, one hand often resting on the swell of her growing child. Martha Jenkins became a regular visitor, bringing practical advice and hand-me-down baby clothes from her own children, now grown and gone. The women of Jamestown, who had once whispered behind their hands about Hazel's scar, now included her in their sewing circles and social gatherings. "It's like they've finally decided I'm acceptable," Hazel remarked to Bryce after returning from a church social. "They've finally seen what I saw from the beginning," he corrected, helping her remove her shawl. "A remarkable woman with more courage and kindness than the lot of them combined. The birth of their son in mid-June was difficult." Labor began in the early morning hours, and Bryce rode like the wind to fetch both Dr. Lewis and Martha Jenkins. For 20 hours, Hazel struggled, her strength waning as the day turned to night. "She's too small in the hips," Hazel heard Dr. Lewis mutter to Bryce outside the bedroom door. "And the baby is positioned wrong. Will she?" Bryce couldn't finish the question, his voice breaking. "I've seen stronger women fail at less difficult births," the doctor replied gravely, "but she has a fighter's spirit." Martha shooed the men away and returned to Hazel's side, bathing her forehead with cool water. "Don't you listen to that old pessimist," she instructed firmly. "You and this baby are going to be just fine." In the darkest hour of the night, when Hazel felt she could push no more, she remembered the fire that had nearly taken her life, the years of rejection and loneliness, and the man who had looked past her scars to see the person beneath. If she had survived all that, she could survive this. With a final, monumental effort, Hazel brought her son into the world. His lusty cries filled the room, bringing Bryce running from his anxious vigil in the hallway. "A boy," Martha announced triumphantly, placing the squalling infant on Hazel's chest. "A fine, healthy boy." Bryce fell to his knees beside the bed, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he gazed at his wife and child. "You did it," he whispered, kissing Hazel's damp forehead. "You wonderful, incredible woman." "We did it," Hazel corrected weakly, smiling despite her exhaustion. "Meet your son, Bryce." They named him Benjamin Harold Foster, after Bryce's father and the neighbor who had become their dear friend. Ben, as they called him, thrived in the Wyoming summer, his cheeks growing round and rosy, his blue eyes so like his father's, taking in the world with curiosity. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ben asleep in Hazel's arms, Bryce said suddenly, "I never thought I'd have this." "Have what?" Hazel asked, looking up from their son's peaceful face. "This," Bryce repeated, gesturing to encompass their home, the land, the three of them together. "A family. A wife who understands the ranch as well as I do. A son." He reached out to stroke Ben's downy head. "After the first 2 women left, I started to believe maybe I was meant to be alone. And I never thought anyone could look at me again without seeing only this," Hazel said, touching her scarred cheek. "When I first stepped off that stagecoach, I was certain you would send me away as soon as you saw me clearly." Bryce took her free hand, bringing it to his lips. "Do you remember what I told you that first day in the cafe?" Hazel smiled, the memory vivid. "You said scars are just proof you were stronger than whatever tried to hurt you." "I meant it then, and I mean it now," Bryce said firmly. "You are the strongest person I know, Hazel Foster. And every day, I thank God that those other women didn't have the sense to see what a good man they were rejecting." Hazel leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, their sleeping son cradled between them. "We're quite the pair, aren't we? The scarred bride and the twice-rejected rancher." "We're exactly who we were meant to be," Bryce replied, his arm tightening around her. "And exactly where we were meant to be." As the years passed, the Foster ranch prospered. Bryce's careful management and Hazel's sharp accounting mind saw them through both good seasons and bad. Ben grew into a sturdy boy with his father's way with horses and his mother's quick intelligence. Two more children joined the family: Emily, born on a snowy December night, and William, who arrived on a beautiful spring morning. Hazel's garden expanded into a proper farm, providing vegetables for their table and extra to sell in town. The Fosters became known throughout the county for their hospitality and fair dealings. Even Hazel's scarred face ceased to be remarkable. It was simply part of Mrs. Foster, the rancher's capable wife, mother to 3 lively children, and a respected member of the community. On their 10th anniversary, Bryce surprised Hazel with a trip to Cheyenne, leaving the children in Martha's care. They stayed in a fine hotel and attended the theater, Hazel resplendent in a new dress Bryce had secretly ordered from Denver. As they walked arm in arm through the bustling streets, Hazel marveled at how different her life had become from what she had once imagined. "What are you thinking?" Bryce asked, noticing her pensive expression. "I was thinking about the girl who boarded that stagecoach in Boston," Hazel replied. "She was so afraid, so certain of rejection. If she could see me now." Bryce stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, uncaring of the people who had to step around them. He took Hazel's face between his hands, his calloused thumbs gentle on her skin, the smooth and the scarred alike. "I saw her," he said with quiet intensity. "I saw her courage and her heart. I saw past what others couldn't. And I've thanked God every day since for bringing you to Jamestown." Hazel smiled up at her husband, seeing the same strong, kind man who had met her at the hotel that day long ago, now with a touch of gray at his temples and more lines around his eyes, lines put there by laughter and life shared together. "You know what you said to me once," she reminded him. "When I told you I was broken." Bryce nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I said you were whole, and you are, Hazel Foster, perfectly, completely whole." In the fading light of the Wyoming evening, surrounded by the bustle of a town so different from their quiet ranch, they shared a kiss that held a decade of love, struggle, joy, and the promise of many more years to come. The scarred mail-order bride and the twice-rejected rancher had found in each other not just acceptance, but a love that saw beyond the surface to the truth that lay beneath. That sometimes the most beautiful things are born from what others might call broken.